Hello. Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay. So I'm going to bring on Sarah. And Sarah Turner today. Hey, Sarah.
Hello. Hey.
Really looking forward to your talk today. So today, Sarah's going to be talking about data probability and can it help make our lives easier? So I won't speak for very long. I'll let her get straight to the point. But yeah, very looking forward to it because what I've heard about is a bit about GDPR. So I want to hear more about that. And so take it away, Sarah.
Okay, let me share my screen. One sec.
Great.
Cool. All right. Well, hi everyone. And let me just there we go. So I'm Sarah Turner, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today for a little bit about data portability. Now, I hope I will talk for about 20 minutes, maybe a bit more like 25. And there might be some questions and stuff at the end. If there's any time left over, I can see the questions in the chat function. So if there's anything that pops up or anything that I say that frustrates or infuriates you, do let me know and I'll probably see it. So today's talk will go in the following sort of format. I'll explain who I am and what I'm doing here. Then I will give a very brief overview about data portability as the GDPR describes it. I appreciate there might be some people here who are not data subjects or working under the rules of the GDPR. I'm sorry. It's fairly all-encompassing, and I've spent a lot of time looking at it. So this is the main way that I'll be looking at portability. In particular, looking at some research I did last year around data portability and Internet of Things products. And after that, I'll spend some time talking about why all of this matters. That in particular, we're at a crossroads, or I think that we are, as to where portability goes, and that GDPR's vagueness may actually be its downfall. And then finally, I'll finish by asking you to consider where, if anywhere, portability might work for you, either in a professional or personal capacity. So, first of all, who am I? And before I get started, I should shamelessly say I'm really interested in connecting with any of you who are interested in anything that I talk about today, or that's listed on the screen just there about things I've done before. My details are at the bottom of every slide. I would really love to hear from you. So, of particular relevance to this talk, one of my co-researchers into data portability and I have recently won a spot at UCL's Startup Incubator to develop our ideas around data portability. So if anything I say is of any interest to you, do get in touch because we'd love to hear from you and your ideas on this. So my background, a little confusingly, perhaps, is in financial services. Prior to having children, I worked for a decade designing, creating, and taking responsibility for technology, which would make the places I worked at compliant to various regulations. In short, I learned to product manage, read regulations, and combine those two things. During my second maternity leave, I started to realize, though, that big tech might need some people who knew stuff about what it was like to work in regulated industries. So I quit and did a master's at UCL in digital technology and public policy. It's there that I encountered data portability and studied it for probably far too long. It's also there that I realized that my interest in tech is not in fixing the big regulatory issues so much as dealing with the fallout of technology suddenly arriving in our lives. As such, right now, I'm doing a PhD looking at how families deal with home IoT devices and keeping them secure. I've done other research on connected toys and how IoT might be used to assist people with hearing loss. I'm also a long-term volunteer and director of a UK infant feeding charity, in particular helping with all their cybersecurity and GDPR issues. So, since I mentioned it, let's talk about GDPR, or more particularly, the rights of data subjects that stem from data protection being considered a fundamental right within the European Union. So there are a few of them that are codified within the GDPR, and today I'm just going to talk about one of the 8, which is data portability. Now on that slide you can see it is number 6, but it's also Article 20. So if I refer to Article 20, it's a synonym for data portability. The interesting thing about data portability is that unlike many of the data subject rights, it was brand new and it wasn't in previous versions of data protection law. So it kind of came out of nowhere. So because it came out of nowhere, I thought I should probably give you an overview of what it is. Within the GDPR, it's defined as written here in nice plain English by the ICO. You have the rights to get your personal data from an organisation in a way that is accessible and machine readable. You also have the right to ask an organisation to transfer your data to another organisation. They must do this if it is technically feasible. There are, as I mentioned before, other versions of data portability either in legislation or about to become legislation in different jurisdictions as well. So for instance, in California, Brazil, Australia and India, there are others as well. Now, there are several important limiting things about the GDPR definition. In particular, it feels like there are a series of sort of gotchas and get-out clauses if you're a data subject. Now, this on the screen now is a graphic that we produced last year. It breaks out the two different limbs of data portability from the point of view of someone wanting to exercise the right for a fitness tracker. First, you can only get data out that you put in. This is to avoid questions of whether or not it would be okay for you to give the inferential data that services may argue is their secret source, the result of their proprietary code, to a competitor. It potentially, however, limits the good stuff that you as a data subject can get out, as it's without any sort of analysis or processing necessarily. Second, the first type of portability is really expected to be the only one that works. And frankly, it's a bit useless. It gives you, as a data subject, the right to ask at a single point in time for your data in a machine readable format. The data controller then has 30 days to give it back to you. And then anything else that happens with that data is up to you as the data subject. Third, the second limb, the second part of data portability is subject to technical feasibility, as mentioned on the previous slide. If I, the data controller, reasonably can argue that a transfer is not technically feasible, they don't have to do it. And there are very many reasonable technical infeasibilities, if you will. There's no standard interchange format for your data. There's no secure means of transferring the data. There's no way of ingesting the data. This, in practice, means that portability under this limb is very rare without significant bilateral agreements. Now, its inclusion in the GDPR stems from the notion that data protection is a fundamental right. So, must be the ability to move data around and use it as you like. That makes perfect sense. If you have a right to protect that data, you have a right to take digital copies from one provider and move it to another. This concept isn't particularly new, and there are a few movements, such as My Data and the arguably more problematic Own Your Data, that look to empower individuals to advocate for their data to be their own. Now, there are two things here. In an ideal marketplace, people could avoid getting locked in to the services of providers they don't like simply because they have historical data with them. This stops people feeling obligated never to buy a device or a service from a new manufacturer, or losing everything when their device breaks or stops being supported. There are other people who believe we should be compensated. They should be believe that we should be compensated for the use of our data. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. There we go. So there are other people who think that we should be compensated for the use of our data, which in theory is a really nice idea until you start thinking about the many ways it could go wrong, and the many ways it could impoverish people or come to some really nasty outcomes. So fundamentally, in a world where almost everything is becoming digitized, not having an ability to move one's data around may make it impossible to do much if our entire life is datafied. Now, as I mentioned before, we did some research into how data portability is currently happening in relation to home IoT devices. The first half of the research is published open access in a journal called New Media and Society. So you can Google that if you're interested, or find it linked from my website, or drop me a note and I can send a copy over to you. A team of 4 of us looked to see whether you could port personal data from one fitness tracker to another and from one smart speaker to another using the rights under the GDPR. Now, this headline, which is from the New York Times, by the way, pretty much summed up the second stage in our research. We reviewed 160 privacy policies to understand what the average data controller says to the average user about data portability. We also interviewed 50 people, a mixture of users, manufacturers, academics, and policymakers, to get an understanding as to what these different groups of people thought about the right. I'll mention the results briefly because I'm sure you can imagine what they were already. We found that it wasn't possible to port data in any meaningful way between the 2 fitness trackers or smart speakers. You could get the data out, but you couldn't put the exported data into the other. And in trying to see if we could do the direct transfer of data, we spoke to both customer services groups and, where possible, privacy departments, and customer service groups had no concept of what the idea was, and the privacy departments just said no. So similarly, in the privacy policies that we looked at, there was a bare minimum of legal information, which seemed to show a lack of thought or interest or understanding, probably more realistically, on the part of the data controller. Of particular note, none of the controllers seemed to explain how they would ingest data, which is of course entirely unsurprising in relation to a brand new regulation with no case law or no meaningful guidance as to how to facilitate any part of that process. The problem is, it leaves a chicken and egg situation. Data controllers don't know how, it would appear, or don't need, very strictly speaking, to make this useful. And so data subjects will never realise it's useful, and so on. And this is kind of what we found in the interviews that we did. The users that we interviewed did not know about the rights, and many of them did not consider their IoT devices to be holding data that they considered valuable. They also assumed that data controllers wouldn't do a good job of helping them even if they asked. Policymakers, including the one quoted here in the purple speech bubble, who was very close to the creation of the GDPR as it's currently implemented, was simply of the view that the implementation of interoperability standards and the like would follow, because that's what industry would do. But that some form of the right, however basic, was necessary to be in the text, as it was a logical step from data protection as a fundamental right. Experts, so the academics and the manufacturers and so on that we interviewed, were much less keen on this sort of, figure it out as we go along approach, suggesting, for instance, that it would be deemed to failure if reliant upon the individual to sort it out, and others pointing out that without guidance as to interoperability standards, it's almost impossible to know where to start. So if this is so broken, so obscure a concept that no one really understands it, and the technical feasibility that the GDPR needs and talks about isn't there, why should we care? When I was thinking about this talk, I was struck, as I often am, by how useful portability could be in its widest sense if you divorce it from the sort of the strict definition of the GDPR. I quite like a world where people realise they produce a duplicative amount of data that places could streamline. Where, for instance, I don't grumble every time I open up my Clue app because I could just link my Fitbit data directly to Clue. So I don't have to tell them about my sleep and energy levels every day because Fitbit already deals with that for me. But because I like both services, but I use them for separate things, but I don't want to do things twice. And I'm not alone in this, for better or for worse. So governments and rulemaking bodies are definitely aware of data portability and what it might do. The European Commission continued to be extremely bullish on its abilities. Not only did it recently launch an antitrust inquiry into the consumer IoT sector in relation to lock-in practices, but their two-year review of the GDPR was very clear on the importance of portability as a fundamental cornerstone of data protection. And there's a quote from them in that document, which is, "Unlocking this potential is one of the Commission's priorities, in particular, since with the increasing use of Internet of Things devices, more and more data are generated by consumers who risk being faced with unfair practices and lock-in effects." Data portability is also at the forefront of other governments' minds, governments with arguably less interests in the right of their citizens than the European Commission. The UK government has been pretty keen on the idea of using portability to facilitate, and this is a quote, "facilitate data access mobility and reuse across and between the private, third and public sectors," as their new National Data Strategy consultation paper puts it. This is very much framed in terms of innovation, unlocking the value of data, and so on. Not a data subject first approach at all, which means that data portability may become less about what we need to keep our data ours, and more about how data can be aggregated, monetized, and so on. And the US's Federal Trade Commission is also very interested in portability at the moment, and they actually held a day-long virtual event on it last month. It's not clear where the FTC may go with this, but one thing is pretty clear. Their interest must, in no small part, be because Facebook is pushing data portability to be a significant answer of the big tech problem. Both Facebook and Google as well have proposed data portability as a means of heading off stricter measures that could see the company split up or otherwise sanctioned for essentially being monopolies. It's been argued for many years that data portability could well be a competition or antitrust remedy if a service has too many users, give them a way to move their data to their competitor, to the company's competitors, with minimal interruption to the user's experience. However, just like with the UK government's interest, portability as defined by Facebook will be vastly different to portability as envisaged under GDPR law. And they might just do what is necessary to stop Congress or the FTC jumping on their back every so often. And as this quote from Australian law firm Gilbert and Tobin sums up, it's unlikely that this argument is Facebook suddenly being altruistic to the point of destroying their business. And that the quote is, "Platforms' enthusiasm reflects the reality that data portability will never curtail the volumes of data that they can harvest from users." So, portability feels like it's at a tipping point right now. The right, limited and frustrating as it is under the GDPR, isn't being used or recognised enough. Our government seems to want to use it as a means of monetizing it. Facebook wants to use data portability as a means of avoiding being broken up. That feels like a bit of a step away from portability that's actually driven by user needs and wants in particular. Now, there are some places where data portability or other forms of portability are being used or prototyped, and I'll go through some of them now. I'll start with the data transfer project. So for a split second, forget all the nasty things I just said about Facebook and Google, because the data transfer project is a collaboration with those and other large firms, started many years ago by employees with real concerns about data concentration within their respective companies. I actually spoke to someone working on the data transfer project last year, and they had such enthusiasm for making portability happen. But as far as I can see, there are 4 potential problems with the data transfer project. The first is that they were struggling to find smaller participants, despite openly calling for members from all areas of the digital technologies community. The second is that their successes are not really super exciting, if I'm being really brutal. Their APIs underpin some photo portability options, notably out of Facebook, and some playlist options at present. Their success stories, and this is point 3, then are bilateral agreements. At the moment, bilateral agreements between big tech and slightly less big tech at best, if not just between big tech and big tech, for instance, moving your Facebook photos to OneDrive. And 4, which is perhaps the most speculative point, if data portability is a way of dealing with antitrust issues, who knows where the data transfer project will stop, and who knows to what extent it will stop being something that is driven by user needs and wants. Other services, such as Databox and Digi.me, to take 2 kind of random examples, work to collect your data and share that data with services as you choose. Databox, I think, was more of a proof of concept than anything else. It was run jointly with BBC's R&D division and some UK universities. And the idea was it handled your streaming services information. Digi.me works with a number of apps and services, allowing the user to manage which data is shared where. Okay, have I gone over?
No, it's okay. You've got about a minute left, if that's okay. Just need to wrap up. We've got the panel discussion coming up, but please wrap up. This is great.
Okay, all right. Well,
about a minute or 2.
All right, I will skip ahead a little bit then.
If that's all right, thanks.
Of course, yeah. So there are a number of reasons why it's not being used, and in particular, it's because people are not clear what portability is or what people could want of it, and also because it's just extremely very technically hard to do. There is no there is no real guide on how to do this, and it just makes it incredibly hard. So I will wrap up super fast with my last slide. So obviously people here today are a mixture of people who create data and people who maintain data, as you know, as people who are working in tech companies and so on. And it'd be really good, if you take nothing else away from this today, just think about how you might, either in a professional capacity or a personal capacity, think about data portability. Can you, as a professional who works with data, think about integrating portability a bit more into what you do? Do you know how your users might find portability of the data they create with you useful? Could you, find ways of using portability? And as an individual, how would you like portability to work? There are a number of different groups that are looking into ways of sort of making portability happen. And if you're interested in an individual capacity, get in touch and I can give you more information. I'll stop there. I'm sorry I rabbited on for so long, but thank you all very much for listening. I really appreciate the time today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. continue your chats when we get the next chance to network and everything. So now we've got the panel. So if everyone can move back to the restructure and sustainability track after this. So I'm going to chuck you out now. Thank you so much. It was amazing. Cheers.